school that my father was sleeping on, right? The bus station, and I buy him breakfast and I go to school to do my presentation. And speaking to her, I realized after for the first time in my life, she said, "This is not normal. You know, the things that you're experiencing are far, far from normal." So it led me to think about the conversations that I have with these young people and the reluctancy to diagnose them because of this. You mentioned suicide, right? And black males is rising more than any other demographic. But what we don't see in those statistics are young people commit a slow suicide, right? A commitment to death that they're infatuated with, where they completely give up on aspiring to be anything, right? And black kids don't shoot themselves in the head. They go join a gang and say, "I'm gonna just have no regard for life and survive at all costs," right? So I just want some feedback in regards to when I'm doing this work. Our administrators in my city will say, "Well, we don't want to publicly label our schools as traumatized students." And I'm like, well, there's been more shootings ever in 2016 in my city than ever documented. At what point will we, as a community, recognize that this is something that's a mental health issue, right? For young people that are failing. How do I contest those arguments in a way where trauma support isn't seen as reactive, right? But necessary.
When I started working on the case, I made some mistakes because I wasn't sensitive enough to the issue that you raised. There is, and David has written eloquently about this, there are real pitfalls that the other side will use. Pitfalls is a way of trivializing it, to suggest that these are damaged communities or that they are communities with pathology. It is a problem. It is a serious problem because we denominate and they play into certain stereotypes that already exist out there. The papers that initially were filed against me talked about the children's unwillingness to learn, the way that they were making bad choices, the way that their families were not supporting education. And the notion was the results for the reason not to do a trauma-sensitive program is because these children were beyond hope and because they were the architects of their own world. I think that is a serious issue that we all confront, that the work that we do, as you put it, will tend to deepen those stereotypes, push those stigmas. And I think there are a few answers to it. I think the first answer is we have to push back in terms of where the stigma is coming from. The stigma is that these kids don't want to learn, that the schools, it doesn't matter what the state of these schools are, because these kids are not worthy about it, they're not going to get out of it, their communities don't do it. I think if we back away from trauma-sensitive programs because of that, which we know will assist them to prosper, then we are reinforcing those stigmas. We have to push back on that, and we have to call it. Everybody here has talked about racism and sexism and poverty, and I think we have to articulate that and not give an inch on it. That doesn't mean you don't have individual responsibility, but goodness, if we turn our back because, and you're not saying this, but if we turn our back on this because of the stigmas that are posed, we are going to build and fortify those sorts of stigmas, and I think we have to call it out every time we see it. The second thing we have to do, which all of you have talked about, and which is the genius behind the Massachusetts model, is that it is community-based. That's who we went to. We went to community groups and community organizations and teachers groups and student and parent groups who address these sorts of issues, and that was the base, and that was the foundation. The problem is that nobody hears those voices, nobody hears those sorts of narratives, and we've got to get them out there. They don't need to hear from any more lawyers or preachers. They need to hear from the individuals themselves. What you just talked about gives a lie to that stigma, and some of the kids that you're talking about, all the kids you're talking about. We've got to do a better job at getting those voices out, and then we've got to do what all civil rights matters do, and that is we have to empower these communities. We have to go, what someone said earlier, to the strength of those communities. I think it is a trick bag to say the communities have enough resources by themselves. Of course they don't. But those communities are the source of the knowledge and the wisdom to that, and that has to be what's up front, and we've got to get that out there. We've got to get that out there. That's the danger of a conference like this, is that we just stay in this room. We stay in this room and we educate each other even deeper, and we reinforce for each other the righteousness of what we're doing. But this has to be hollered from the rooftops. You didn't hear a word about this in the presidential campaign. You didn't hear a word about this in the debate. You don't hear a word about this. And it is our job to work with the community organizers and the communities to get out there. And you know, my first move after working with the community was to go to the teachers, who were beleaguered into this. The absentee rate of teachers and turnover of teachers is as high as the absentee rate of students. And we've got to get those voices out there and those voices credible. And we have to believe that when those voices are out there, the power of those narratives is what we are. Because in the end, every one of us is a parent. When Sandy Hook happened, they rushed mental health counselors there. Beverly Hills has more mental health counselors than Compton has teachers. And we've got to get that out there. And if there are those who won't join it, then we know who the us and they are. But we got to get those stories out there, because they are powerful stories, they are beautiful stories, they are stories of the American dream, and we ought to push that and push that and push that, so everyone cannot back away from the truth.
Just real quick, having lived in Newark before the heroin came, I think there's a rule in the room that we don't deal with that impacts our schools. One is that in Newark in particular, which is different from Philly and New York, because the drugs weren't in the same, they didn't come in the same. They came in three ways to Newark. They came in through wealthy people coming down Clinton Avenue and Springfield Avenue in exchange for LSD. They came in through organized crime working with FBI to undermine the Black Power movement in Newark. And they also came in through military transfer planes, which are not checked. So when we're talking about this, we need to look at the history. One of the things we don't talk about, and the young lady, the doctor, talked about the history. We teach history from a nationalistic perspective. We don't teach history. And so when we're dealing with this, we ignore the fact that we have a 50 years of heroin epidemic in the city of Newark, 45 years of crack cocaine. And what they did is cut off cultural remedies that can help these children if you had the historical knowledge that was coming past for generations. Yes. The second thing is that there are cultural remedies, and I hope that people are considering them. These were the same remedies that allowed chattel slaves to survive. And we need to, look at that. And then the last thing, we have decided as a country, as a society, either decided or that we've been frightened into accepting the fact that we accept the fact of militarization of our country and how much money we spend on this as opposed to remedying these type of situations. In terms of remedies, I was listening to the two young men talking about the situations. One is that they took civics out of schools. And they took civics out of schools in the urban areas in the early 60s. Why? Because what happens is you allow other people to determine how you're going to appropriate the tax money of people in those communities. So if you know civics, you know how to make government accountable. You know how to make government accountable, then you can control where your resources are going to go, so you'll have money to deal with these issues. So I just wanted to make those points. No question.
One more.
My name's Kelly. I've worked in a few roles within the children's system of care here in New Jersey, primarily as a parent advocate, teaching parents how to get what their children are legally entitled to in school for students that have IEPs and 504s. I've been involved in the Newark school system, attending IEP meetings and things like that. So I understand what the barriers and challenges are, especially in our urban areas. There's been a big shift since I was a child. I'm a lot older than a lot of people in this room, but when I was a child, our elementary schools were the pinnacle of our communities. All pro-social activities occurred at the school. So we had our sporting, basically everything except worship happened at the school. So our communities, members who lived in the community were involved in the school. So now that we're talking about what schools' responses are to trauma, how do we involve the community again so they're involved as part of the system?
And before you answer that, I just want to say, all of you have actually asked the questions that I actually had listed. Who wants to take that question? Okay. I think it's very powerful when the community obviously is involved, and in order to engage the community, you have to meet them where they are. When you're looking at a lot of our communities, they don't go to mental health professionals, they go to the pastor, they go to the church, or they go to other places outside of mental health, because there's such a stigma. So one of my degrees is in Christian counseling, because we have to break down the misnomer that it's not for us, that we can pray this away, that we can do X, Y, and Z. And God's very powerful. I'm not an anti-God, I'm a Christian, but the idea that we can use the tools that He has given us in order to help heal ourselves. So I think meeting the people where they are, engaging them in a culturally appropriate way. One of the reasons why I joined the Association of Black Psychologists is because Black psychology is not taught in our universities, African-centered psychology is not taught, and the idea that we have the tools, that we don't need somebody coming in telling us, oh, you need to do this. Within our own culture, we have the tools in order to heal ourselves, but how do we tap into that if you don't know that, haven't been taught that? So one of the things ABSI is doing is we have something called the Emancipation Circles, where it's identifying the lie of Black inferiority, and really understanding that that we have been constantly told that we are less than. And so building our communities, whether it be Black communities, Latino communities, Asian communities, building up our communities with the tools that they have is important. So again, like Mark was saying, not necessarily us coming in and saying this is what you need, really doing a need assessment. You tell us what you need. How can we help you help yourselves as well? So thank you to our amazing panel. Really good.
So we're almost there, folks. We're going to have a fairly seamless transition because I've been the MC, and so I want to announce the next moderator, but there is no next moderator, it's me. So you're stuck. But we have about, so we can stay more or less on time. I'm going to speak for less time than I thought, try to open it up and make sure we have time to give Dr. Gracie all before we adjourn for some libations. And we're just going to get my PowerPoint.
Here's a perfect email to have opened up just right now. An email from Advocates for Children of New Jersey. And it says, State House renovation, we're investing in I don't go to the to sit there. We get the material. Right. Yes. I don't know how they chose their words. I get letters and email almost every day from the J Spotlight.
And my email is L, first initial last name, at CSI. One more.
Most people live in their own pockets and make pockets all around, or else they live in suburbs. That's great wealth.
Okay. So it's a little odd that I would wait so long to get this PowerPoint on this. I think I'm going to disavow it. And I'm going to try to shake things up, turn a little bit so I can see my friends on this side of the room. Finally, I'm going to ask you all if we can begin. Folks, if we can begin. So I think by now it must be clear that this is dangerous territory. You know, you can come at it from a lot of different standpoints. And, you know, there's a kind of a politeness that begins the day. And then the more you hear testimony from people in their actual experiences, in the classroom, in their lives, among their children, their families, their neighborhoods, their neighbors, you begin to see the depths of marginalization that all of this represents, and that it is really almost too serious for words. And so I'm going to abandon some of what I said in order to provoke some reactions with all due respect, because I consider all of you friends, and I think we're building a community that did not begin in this room, but can certainly advance from today's shared experiences. I was going to talk about this article that's available to all of you. And I was going to do it in the context of trying to lift up some ideas around resiliency in the context of discussing intervention on the one hand versus prevention on the other. And I'm still going to try to do that, but I'm not so sure I need to rely as much on the PowerPoint, because frankly I'm just so fired up by so many of the things that I've heard, and I want to sort of get down to it. But I do need to start a little bit at the beginning in the sense that I really don't want trauma to be the new thing. And I, you know, with all due respect, a lot of what we've learned today is sort of the discovery of the pervasiveness of psychological trauma in the lives of people, like right in front of us, and sometimes in ourselves. And all of that is critically important consciousness. So I don't for a minute begin to suggest that that's not the beginning of a path to recovery and resiliency. But sometimes we get stuck in that. And my role as a lawyer, as a civil rights lawyer, as a law professor, is to try to move beyond that in recognition of what it represents. So I really hope that what comes out of conferences like this are not a cottage industry of trauma specialists. I want to put that cottage industry out of business almost as quickly as it begins, right? I don't want trauma to be the new thing. I want equality and opportunity to be the new thing. And I don't want to accommodate trauma. I don't want to learn how to think in novel ways about trauma. I just want to understand trauma so that we can figure out how to eliminate trauma, at least at this level. Trauma is obviously a part of struggle, it's a part of life. It's a part of what makes us human, but clearly what we're talking about is the deep end of trauma. The deep end of trauma that works in madly debilitating ways to corrupt opportunity, oftentimes irreparably, and therefore unacceptably. And so the struggle that we have, certainly in the law as an advocacy profession, and I hope for all of us, is to figure out how we go from description to action that yields prevention, right? So we've heard a fair amount of description today, but I just want to suggest, piggybacking off some of the wonderful things that Mark was saying, that the way you think about this as a civil rights issue is that description has to work in such a way as to frame the contents of a legally recognized interest, right? That's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to understand the neurobiology, we're trying to understand the psychology, we're trying to understand the effects in the classroom so that we can define a legally recognizable interest. Because a legally recognizable interest can then be enforceable like a right. Right? So that, as Mark said, you're not begging philanthropies. You're suing under a right to get what is necessary in order to enforce that right. That right has to be very fundamental to being. And that's one of the beauties of this democracy. But one of the deep and tragic failures of this democracy is that so often rights are eviscerated. If we can define this interest or this status that then becomes legally enforceable, we can, we hope, obligate systems to respond in certain ways. And if they don't respond in certain ways, then something bad happens. So we create an infrastructure of accountability while at the same time asserting the human rights, the dignity of individuals whose interests have to be protected. And this is really how rights change institutional norms and command the public resources that we've been talking about, directly and indirectly, may be difficult to get. And so the best example of what we're talking about is indeed the disabled. I mean, disability is a civil rights issue. And it really wasn't a civil rights issue. It was one of the last civil rights issues, like LGBT rights, to come on the horizon. And we, as in the case of LGBT, we are still struggling to figure out the constitutional fundament for disability rights. And so in many respects, today suggests an expansion of disability. That's what a lot of the description from a legal standpoint suggests. And why would we do that? If we recognize that there is a racial implication to so much of what we've discussed today, as well as an economic implication to so much of what we've discussed today, why would we lean toward disability as the category, the status, the interest that should get legal protection? And it's because of the workings of structural inequality. Because structural inequality, like its cousin, institutional racism, has worked as racism without racists. It's created a kind of a colorblind operation where the same people can be consistently subordinated systematically, institution after institution, without anyone being held accountable for the violation of certain rights based on protected racial status. So we wander the legal terrain for a category of lives that legally matter, because black lives don't, in this sense. So let me tell you how we came as Climb to this project. This was really not about schools originally. This was really about the recognition of how debilitating trauma was in the lives of so many poor people, most of them of color, but not all of them of color by any means. But as all of you know, the rights of poor adults are not the basis for a movement. Because the rights of poor adults are not recognized as entitled to much compassion, let alone legal protection. It's the hardest thing you could probably go up against. So we pick children, in part because of the importance of asserting innocence. Because of the sense that, well, they haven't done anything to violate a sense of personal responsibility or anything that comes out of a conservative canon to suggest that these people don't deserve our compassion or our help. They are innocents, and innocents deserve protection. And of course, the status of being a child, minority status in that sense, is something that almost always raises legal protections. So why do we pick schools? We pick schools because you're trying, in essence, to trigger a duty. You're trying to trigger a duty. You're trying first to identify a duty that some institution has to this particular population, and then you want to articulate what that duty is. Now, we know that schools have multiple duties to children. In fact, those of you who teach, or those of you who are in leadership in schools, know that those duties expand constantly. You know, I also teach tort law, so we see an expansion in the tort law of schools and school districts with respect to the duties owed to children. So this is established ground. You have innocence, you have a public institution through which virtually every single child goes, so you can catch everybody, and you have pre-existing obligations. And so the question then becomes, in the case of trauma, a duty to do what? And a lot of what the conference today has been about, in non-legal terms, is what is that duty? And so in the article, at least as I was thinking about the article and as we were thinking about the research, we're trying to figure out, do we really expect schools to be the first actor? Do we really expect schools, if this is a set of mental health problems, do we really expect schools to be the institution that has the capacity to do the work? And I'm not so sure. That's part of what I want to talk about. I am not so sure. Even after hearing all the wonderful things we've heard today, I'm still not so sure that schools are that. I can think of one duty that schools can have, and that is certainly to identify, right? If we're talking, let's say we're talking at the extreme end of the behavioral or psychological spectrum, because it's not always behavioral, right? In the case of particularly girls who disassociate and more often experience depression, and therefore who want manifesting systems that are disruptive in the class and get the attention of teachers, right? So do schools at a minimum have an obligation, have a legally definable obligation to identify the possibility of trauma-related disorders in their children? If they have that sentinel obligation, then what? Right? Now, a lot of what we've talked about today has been bringing services into the schools and actually doing more, asking teachers to do more. And no disrespect, I think it's absolutely necessary, and I'm not ignoring that. But I am questioning it a little bit. And the primary reason that I'm questioning it is because of a thesis that then develops out of the work, which is, if I'm right in the first instance, if the premise is correct, that the kinds of traumas that we just saw listed, the sources of trauma that we just saw listed on the board, occur disproportionately in very low-income neighborhoods, if those traumas, especially those associated with violence, concentrate in areas of concentrated poverty, then you can map trauma by zip code. And if you can map trauma by zip code, well, I can show you a whole bunch of other things that we can map. But what is special about trauma then is it is the internalization of structural inequality. It is the symptomatology of structural inequality. It is what happens to human beings who are subjected to a set of environmental conditions that are repeated in similar kinds of environments, similar kinds of neighborhoods, similar kinds of zip codes across the country. And therefore, it implicates much more than what a teacher can possibly do. All right? Therefore, the question that Mark was asked, like, what are you trying to solve poverty? Yeah, you're trying to solve poverty. You're trying to solve poverty. But the question that raises then is, do we solve poverty? Do we solve structural inequality simply by recognizing the resource disparities between poor schools and rich schools and try to bring more resources to that school to ameliorate a continuing condition of traumatizing experience? Or do we say, no, this interest that we have identified has to be one of the arguments against structural inequality too. We have to see this end. And so it was interesting to come across in the public health literature how frequently public health scholars would recognize in the context of violence how important it is to see violence as a public health issue and to recognize, oh my goodness, we've got, we're seeing so much institutional racism playing upon all of this, and we recognize that, this is, the sense of humiliation and alienation and social isolation are affecting so much behavior. But when it comes to a remedy, that's too big to approach. And with no disrespect to the public health scholars, we can't keep passing that argument off, right? We can't just keep kicking that can down the road. We can't keep talking about widening inequality in this country, recognizing with much greater sophistication the kinds of debilitating neurological, psychological, and physiological effects it has epigenetically, and think we're going to just do intervention in schools. I mean, that's the conundrum, right? That's the conundrum. What do we do with this knowledge? And how do we do prevention? So the last thing I'll say before I sort of open it up is what I found fascinating, beautiful, and tragic about psychological trauma as an issue has been alluded to by so many of the fabulous speakers today, but I just want to highlight it. Because again, as a lawyer, I'm looking for that interest that can't be dismissed. I'm looking for that one thing, that one thread that I have that I can assert to overcome a motion to dismiss in the case of litigation or to rally legislative force around an issue. And that is that this is intensely human. This reaction to traumatic experience is really part of what makes us all human. This is the organism doing what the organism does, doing what most organisms do when presented with a threat, when experiencing fear. When certain things are elicited and chemicals are discharged and processes involuntarily kick into gear, as they have for thousands and thousands of years, regardless of culture, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of gender, regardless of race. So this is the canary in a coal mine issue, right? This is the worst things that can happen to people who survive atrocity committed by other people. And we're learning this through, among other people, our poorest children. And that has to be the basis for a prevention argument. I mean, I know we live in a world gone mad, and I know it is extraordinarily hard to think about what we can do at a federal level. But maybe that's okay. Maybe part of what this represents from a prevention standpoint is a recognition that it has to come home a little bit more. I mean, when we think about the institutions, and that's what structural inequality is about, right? It's about comparing the resources available to the key institutions that determine or retard opportunity in people's lives. When you go to a wealthy neighborhood, you see well-functioning institutions, and when you go to a poor neighborhood, you see under-resourced, overmatched, poorly performing institutions, right? So that suggests a certain localism. That suggests a certain local locus of power. So when we're thinking about change, we can think about the structure of public institutions, private institutions that bear upon certain environments. And we can do some of what's been discussed today in the name of prevention. We can certainly do trauma-sensitive reforms. But we also have to untrap people. We not only have to work hard within these local institutions to make people's lives better and make the institutions available to them work more effectively on their behalf, but we also have to recognize that in almost every one of these stories we've heard, we're talking about people who could not follow that fundamental instinct to leave if they wanted to. To leave if they wanted to, right? This is what segregation does. It isolates and it traps. And so it concentrates all these ills so that the institutions become very difficult. So what I would have put on the board in terms of the kinds of remedies, preventive remedies, that I would suggest in the name of all of this are a combination of housing strategies, housing mobility strategies, housing stability strategies, as well as strategies to try to unencumber the effects of being trapped by enriching and altering the norms by which certain critical institutions within neighborhoods operate. So I'm going to put the questions up because that's really all that remains of the talk. And I hope I've provoked a little bit, but more importantly, I hope I've sort of added one last thing to so much of what's already been said by so many already today. And now if we could just spend a few minutes just talking. You don't have to ask questions. I'm not going to pretend to be the expert up here. I was a psych major, but that's so long ago. But I do want to challenge you to think either of your interventions as preventions or to think beyond intervention to prevention. And just hear, your thoughts on where we go from here. Is that a question or a statement?
Yeah.
Please.
So, I agree with you about reflecting on whether schools are the best place for trauma services, and I say that specifically. In terms of just thinking about this holistically, I really, in fact, believe that making schools and all of our institutions trauma-informed is essentially saying we need to create universal precautions. That's what trauma-informed is. It's not trauma-specific. It's making an assumption that there are children who have been traumatized, and there are children who haven't been. We don't actually need to create, in keeping with your zip code point, we don't really need to know the details of any child's experiences to create an environment in which he or she feels safer. And so it's really interesting that universal precautions are the best clinical practice for people who have these kinds of experiences and issues. But it's also good clinical practice for everybody. So if we have good trauma-informed schools, it's good for the kids who are having a tough time. It's also good for the kids who aren't having a tough time. But the irony of that is, isn't that what we should expect of our schools anyway? Mm-hmm. That's it, I'm happy.
Listening to you talk, I didn't know where you were going with your provocative statements at first, but I could hear a little bit more about how someone mentioned redlining, or you can see with housing and housing vouchers, or you can see how you would bring really disparate groups together and say, you know, looking, I don't know, Terry Gross had this guy talking about how all of the money that was lost by redlining and how that loss of wealth in certain communities is like this trickle-down effect that just compounds, the same way trauma does. So in hearing how you talk about interventions and strategies of prevention, you can see why real estate developers and then other disparate groups like people who work in schools or mental health professionals or law enforcement or people who want to have better outcomes, you know, or better employees would have a lot of interest in saying there's certain things that aren't talked about as much, whether that's sundown towns or reparations or ways to move people from you know, higher education who wouldn't have an opportunity. So there is some sort of way to say beyond just the local school system and grassroots organizations, those partnerships really have to be able to say, well, what's in it for me? And acknowledge some of the wrongs that have been done. And I'm not sure how that happens, because often it is really kind of just washed over, and we're looked ahead and saying these are bad people, or you know they should try harder. But I think when you speak more truth about those underlying issues and why that's the way it is, then people are more inclined to say, well, I don't know if I contributed to that, or if I'm a beneficiary of that system, but I'm in a position now where maybe I can help shift that a little bit. So I think oftentimes when you look at housing for young people who age out, you see public-private partnerships for tax rebates, right? So it's a really good way for people to feel good saying, we'll use our tax benefits for this nonprofit, we'll get housing, but expanding something like that on a broader scale to say, it just doesn't end with that. Well, let's acknowledge that maybe if we had more of a tax base in this area, right, in Vailsburg, right, we wouldn't have needed that as much. So I think those are the conversations that they have to be really chosen and careful, but they're really pointed. They can move different systems. You wouldn't think that they were aligned, but they have a lot of common interests, more often than not.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Carrie Lagoso Mizarella, and I direct the Greater Newark Healthcare Coalition, a nonprofit that you heard about before through Dr. Moore. And our goal is healthcare access and quality, improving that in Newark for the residents of Newark, and reducing healthcare disparities. And our membership is healthcare leaders in Newark. So I think two things strike me when you just pose the questions, and thank you for today. I mean, this is the beginning of a conversation. I think not, you know, one and done kind of deals, but thanks for bringing us together. Schools strike me and our organization as an opportunity of one of the strategies, not the strategy, because they are an anchor system in a community like healthcare that has a lot of face time with the community members. And so that presents an opportunity to either exacerbate problems, right, if you're not doing work well, just like the healthcare system, to, at a minimum, just keep things the way they are in the middle ground, or to help improve outcomes. So I really do believe in schools as a part of the solution. I agree with you that you don't want to just saddle schools now with, it's your problem, fix it, when we know it's not their doing. They're part of, hopefully, the solution. And to the point about other prevention or other strategies, it didn't come up today because the nature of the topic today is schools, but I think maternal and child health is a huge piece of the prevention. You know, we know in utero, I mean, that I've heard a talk that was so powerful about 9 months to save the world, right? Because so much wiring is happening in utero, and that's another opportunity, not to put the onus on the pregnant mom as the be-all, end-all, but an opportunity to heal. And then the first 1,000 days, the first 3 years. So, you know, as far as getting the wiring right and those initial attachments, that's another area where we really have to think about what's going on and what we're not doing well. Everything from our C-section rates to our low breastfeeding rates to our, you know, child welfare involvement under 5 years old and kids being taken from their birth parents, and what does that do? So I think it's a multi-pronged, putting it lightly, approach, but I'm grateful to be in the space. I'm also an attorney, but grateful to be in the space to look through the healthcare lens as part of the social justice solution. And I think we need to braid that sector and the school sector and the justice sector and these different sectors together under the lens of what overarching challenges you're putting out there, racial and socioeconomic inequality, and how do all of these systems work together to improve the lives of people we serve.
Well, I see the prevention angle very clearly in what you're saying about maternal and child health. How do you think awareness of trauma, its experience, its transmission, its consequences, how important is that to improving institutions that do child and maternal health prevention.
So I think the key there is, so brain science, understanding it more as a brain as an organ to some degree, because there's something about, like, even if you equate it to diabetes or other disease states, once people understand kind of what's going on without overwhelming them, if coupled with the tools to help themselves, and I'm thinking of things at prenatal yoga, other strategies, that if people understand breathing and other tools that they can do that are free and they would have within their grasp, that's the one piece, and there's all the other, behavioral health and other safety and security and other things, and the housing and the other stability stabilizers, of course. But I think as long as you're making the information discreet enough and personal enough and coupling it with a toolkit, then I think it's powerful for the person.
So, first of all, I just have to say this was an excellent day. This is really, really great. So thank you so much. And so I want to go to number 2 and then number 1, and it'll all be very quick. So number 2, I think, is, do we risk pathologizing people experiencing complex trauma? And I think the answer to that is yes, and it really worries me. And thinking about it within the context of school, I think the issue is that once we start doing that, like once we start focusing so much on trauma, then kind of what it infers for me as an educator is like, I'm at the top of my game. Like, I'm just killing it right now. There's nothing else I need to improve, because here's the problem. The problem is Johnny's got this trauma. The problem is, somebody got arrested. Like this, these are all the problems. So then once that's the frame, then I am going to focus less on my practice, and I'm going to focus less on my own competence, because I'm now locating that with this person, right? Or these children. And I think that the most effective interventions, I do think it makes sense to have some of these interventions in schools, but the risks associated with them is sort of this, kind of like when you said you don't want trauma to be the new thing. It's like, we don't want every half an hour, like people are just, well, gee whiz, like we need to make this referral, we need to make this other, like, it could become, I don't know, the word escapes me, but it could become like kind of like an overkill, right? So that it becomes oversubscribed, and that becomes the go-to thinking, which is about that pathologizing. So I think that's just what I'm worried about. But I do think, yeah.
Did you want to comment on the first one?
So I think the most effective interventions do involve proactively, like, the work that Massachusetts has done, which is to, provide professional development and to have a trauma-informed environment. But I also think that that's a part that we're not thinking enough about. Like when we talk about restorative justice, we never talk about like restoring, we have to restore something, and we have to restore relationships. So if I don't have a relationship with you, then there's nothing to restore. So a lot of times we think about these things down the road without thinking about what are the things